So thank you for this Friday afternoon for everyone's interest in our presentation from Dr. Ebanks. And hello, I recognize a number of faces. My name is Dr. Karen McNeil, and I am the PI of the Auburn's NSF NRT program in coastal resilience. And we have a few seminar speakers that we invite, and Dr. Ebanks was one that we wanted to invite this semester. Dr. Ebanks is currently a tenured associate professor at Savannah State University in the Department of Marine and Environmental Sciences in the College of Science and Technology. She earned her master's from Savannah State in 2005. And her PhD from the Rosenthal School of Marine and Atmospheric Science at the University of Miami in 2010. She is near and dear to my own heart. I have a marine science background myself, so I'm really excited to hear about her talk. But a little more about Dr. Ebanks. She does a lot of work in marine science, but also has been working in K-12 work and outreach work, and most recently she's been working with a grant funded by the NSF called Expanding HBCU Pathways for Geoscience Education, and HBCU stands for Historically Black Colleges and Universities. So I'm really excited for y'all to hear from her today, because I think we're going to have opportunities for you to ask questions in the chat. You will not be able to unmute yourself. That is just a security feature since this was more open. You will not be able to unmute yourself or share screen or anything like that, but you will be able to put questions in the chat, and we will make sure Dr. Ebanks gets those questions as she goes. And she also will have a poll question for you. So this will be time to engage as well. So without further ado, I would love for Dr. Ebanks to go ahead and share her screen and get us started today.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And yes, thank you for coming on your Friday afternoon. And let me get some of these little boxes out of the way that might be blocking your view.
I can't see anything.
Okay, awesome. It's kind of nice to be able to see everyone's faces when you're doing this, but without like the master set of screens, you can't do that. So, but as long as you guys can see fine, we're good to go. So I decided to start from the topic of broader impacts. We hopefully all get into the science fields wanting to have an impact. There are a lot more non-scientists or people who say that they are not a scientist than people who say that they are a scientist out there. And so the idea of broader impacts is something that's always been important for me, but has become more dear to me. And I've been really paying close attention to it. And so we'll talk a bit about that today. But from the title from the back of the page, to Reoccurring Theme, a scientist's systematic approach to elevating science. And so you guys are in a climate in our NRT is my understanding. You've kind of focused on that. And so one of the things that Dr. McNeil mentioned to me was there might be some interest in the snail work that I'd done before, because there were some threads that were tied into climate and changes in the climate. And so I thought I'd pull out a bit of the relevant parts. I have lots. I could talk for a long, long time if anybody wants to talk after, but I just wanted to kind of pull out a few things and talk about those. And looking at how ambient water chemistry can have an important impact on embryonic shell formation, as well as adult shell formation in the common pond snail, Lymnaea stagnalis. And so I just have a couple of slides here related to that project. You can see have some snails here in an egg casing. So this is the the full egg casing with embryonic snails that develop, and they do direct development. So they actually hatch out as little small versions of the adults. And in freshwater environments, there are very low concentrations of calcium and carbonate, both important to shell formation. And this work was done at RASMUS, Rosenstiel School of Marine and Environmental Science, Marine and Atmospheric Science. And part of it was presented at SEB, the Society for Experimental Biology. And part of the work was done at McMaster University. And the majority of my funding as a graduate student was through the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Environmental Cooperative Science Center through the Educational Partnership Program. And so one thing that I wanted to kind of point out was that in order for these snails to recover their extracellular fluids, which they actually get rid of when they are evading predation by retracting into their shell, they have to recover all of their fluids. And in one of the 3 papers that I want to talk about, we looked at how they recovered their fluids, and it was done by water first, then the solutes in various rates over a period of about 5 days for full recovery. But the most important solutes were recovered within hours, which is remarkable in freshwater. And so looking at some of the possible endpoints are Y variables, response variables that we were focused on. We were able to look at not only in the adults, which is what were analyzed here, then to look at the embryos and see how they were forming their shell, how they were acquiring the solutes that were necessary for development. As I mentioned earlier, they do exhibit direct development. And because they are doing this at an incredible rate in the freshwater environment, and also because calcium and lead look a little bit alike, chemically speaking, in terms of cation acquisition, we looked at calcium and carbonate and bicarbonate uptake as they were forming their shell in that embryonic casing that I was showing you a couple of slides ago. And looking at that as a way for possibly looking at the environment and how the environment is changing by seeing how these embryos are developing under different environmental conditions. And the third paper was focused more on the mechanisms. So how were they acquiring this? And that's the one that's really, I felt was most tied to the climate discussion that you all kind of center around for your NRT. And so, of course, the title of this one is Characterization of Mechanisms for Calcium and Bicarbonate Carbonate Acquisition for Shell Formation in Embryos of the Freshwater Common Pond Snail, Lymnaea stagnalis. And I mentioned McMaster earlier, and that's where Mike O'Donnell's located. And so that involved going somewhere, which was very interesting. And we'll talk about different aspects of getting outside of your box in a moment. But that involved actually going up to Canada for a couple of trips to do analyses of the embryos using various analytical techniques there that he has as a proprietary instrumentation. And so in brief, the way that they take up calcium, we took a couple of approaches. We did the voltage specific electrodes with the O'Donnell lab, but before going up, and just to kind of as a preliminary data set, we looked at voltage dependent channels using blockers and pharmaceutical blockers, NHE or proton exchangers, cation proton exchangers, using blockers, and baphlomycin, which is specifically blocking proton excretion. And so as you're talking about climate changes and acidification in various environments and how that's tied to climate, it was important as we began to really take a look at this to see that not only was it important for calcium acquisition, it was also important for bicarbonate carbonate acquisition, to have the ability to acidify or not acidify the membrane, basically the edge of the mantle where shell is formed, to be able to control that degree of acidification, allow the snail to be able to form shell. And in an environment that's artificially acidified, unnaturally acidified, that's going to impact the snail's ability to take up calcium and to excrete protons in a large way. And so based on the two sets of analyses with pharmaceutical blockers of the exchangers, the proton pumps, and the carbonic anhydrase activity, we were able to really kind of develop a basic kind of model looking at the apical membrane, which is the outside. And so for all the geology folks, thank you for bearing with me with the all of the biology and physiology. I get the great opportunity of engaging with geologists at several of the meetings that I'll mention in a moment. And I love the crosstalk that takes place. So this is the last real one like this, just so you know. But the apical membrane is the outside, and that can be outside to the environment, the external environment, or it can be outside to the digestive tract. Whichever part is exposed, that's the apical membrane. And then the basolateral membrane is the side that's going to be on the blood side, or the internal side of the cell, if we're using this as our kind of a schematic of a cell. And so if we have voltage dependent calcium channels, that's what VDCC stands for, and those are needing to work in conjunction with electrogenic proton exchangers, then if they're unable to get rid of these, so they see the protons here, if the environment is already acidic, this will have a hard time happening. This pump will have a hard time functioning. And so that shuts down all of these other parts. That's the bottom line. And what we were seeing was in the treatments where we had blocked these channels, blocked the channel, blocked the exchanger, blocked the pump, the shells did not form. They basically looked kind of like amorphous blobs. The snail did not develop in the same way as when these transporters were active. And so that's, in this way, that's tied to some concerns with climate change because of the concerns for acidification of the environment. And I'd be glad to talk with you more about that at some point. So after I finished my PhD, it was kind of a, where do I go from here? What do I do next? And I was able to call my master's advisor, who I did my master's here at Savannah State. And I basically said, well, I didn't do any TAing. So I'm curious. I taught English to Japanese nationals when we lived in Japan, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So I kind of enjoyed teaching, but I don't know if I really want to do it. And so she said, call her. At the time, they were looking for someone to teach Intro to Marine Biology. It's a course for non-science majors here at Savannah State. And we are a university with about 3,500 students. And then we have a marine sciences bachelor's program and environmental science bachelor's program, a master's in marine science. And there's also quite a few offerings in aquarium systems as well. We are, you know, my hubby might be on. I'm not sure. I thought I saw his tag pop up when everyone was filing in. But it's kind of scary to me that my husband and I, when we, in the 2 separate years that we finished school, you can see the blip in the iPad's data that is my graduation and his graduation from our PhD. And to me, that just blows my mind every time I look at it. But SSU is responsible for a large number of people of color from going into the oceanographic sciences, going into the coastal science as well, marine sciences. And so we have I find it to be a unique program, and I wasn't totally convinced until last night. I got a call from a former REU student that basically said, I enjoyed the time at Savannah State and I really want to come back, and she would like to do a master's. And that really was important to me because I know that a lot of people do not have positive experiences in REUs and different things along the way. But a lot of people have positive experience. So it kind of goes both ways, of course, but it was encouraging to be able to hear of her positive experience, and that how that made her played a large role in her wanting to come back and do a master's. And so we do embedded courses with internships where students are getting research experience kind of right out of the gate, as much as possible, extensive field-based and shipboard experiences, being able to learn about the rules of the waterway, being able to take research cruises either on our vessels or our partnering vessels. We have quite a few collaborative relationships in the region and even outside of the region too. And lots of training in tech writing, statistics, GIS, all tools that are fantastic to have in your tool belt. And I'm sure you guys have heard that as a part of the NRT, that these are all things you should know how to do, and you want to get exposure to it and revisit it as much as possible. We do focus on place-based learning, so really understanding the environment in which you've been trained, as well as professional advancement and service learning. And I have a sinker slide at the end if anyone wants to talk about service learning and how important that is in classes. We've had NSF GK-12 programs and Coast Camp programs, all very important in terms of the pathway. I've mentioned to several of the Auburn faculty our REU program. That's the point of contact is Dr. Tara Cox, and that program has been running for many years, and it brings together usually about 10 students from across the country, and it's a great opportunity, first time research experience. And so I wanted to poll if we could do that, I was just curious, how many people have had some sort of research experience, whether it's a labeled REU or internship that's not an REU or an apprenticeship? I was just curious. Look at that. That is awesome. Okay. I love seeing it kind of feed in real time. And it's K through grade, so everybody. All right. We're kind of stalled at 70%, so I guess we have to close it. But that's good. That's great to see that you're taking advantage of those opportunities. It makes such a big difference in helping you to figure out what it is that you want to do after you finished with whatever this particular stage is for you. Let's see if I can make that go away. Okay. And so here we also have the NOAA Living Marine Resources Cooperative Science Center, which is another part of the educational partnership program that I mentioned a moment ago. Dr. Dion Hoskins and actually also Dr. Victoria Young are our points of contact for that. And we have an LSAMP. I'm not sure, I can't remember if you all had one there in Auburn, but it's those LSAMPs are really great opportunities for being able to get professional development as well. And then several others that are mentioned down at the bottom if you're curious about them. And so I have a two-body honor. And people often say a two-body problem, but I find it a two-body honor. My husband and I did the undergraduate program here at Savannah State together, went to Japan with him as a naval officer as part of a community in the Navy called the Meteorology and Oceanography. And we were a part of that community for the first 3 years of our lives together. We have two sons, and one was actually born in Japan, and he is followed 12 years later by a little brother. We're both HBCU alums, and it's been a great ride. And 21 years later, we're still doing the same fields and still enjoy going to the aquariums together. Both faculty at Savannah State. I'm in my office right now. His office is right next door. And it's really neat to have people walk around and say, Doctors Ebanks. It's really quite fun. We are both members of the HBCU Geosciences Working Group. That's the GWG. And that was initiated at the Earth Educators Rendezvous a few years ago. And it's a great opportunity to kind of network between the HBCUs. And that's kind of where the program birthed out of that was mentioned earlier. And I'll talk a tiny bit about that in a little while. Before I even got a lab, I was able to mentor about 20 undergraduate research projects and a couple of grad students. And now it's great. I usually have 2 to 4 graduate students and anywhere from 5 to 10 undergrads each year. And our projects have been varying from vacant lands and food deserts and how we can use those two problems in municipalities and meet the needs of those two problems using aquaponics and geological agriculture, as well as conventional or more conventional urban gardening techniques using public and private partnerships, as well as partnerships with the municipality. And spiny lobster research, I have a slide for that in a moment, coastal hazards, microplastics, as well as geoscience education research that is currently ongoing. So Coral Thompson, she's now Coral Minchie, and she worked on benzoate pyrene, which is a product of combustion, and looked at how it impacted reproduction in grass shrimp. You can see her from her K-12 activity, her stuffed shrimp made from socks to teach students about parasitism in grass shrimp. And these are incredibly important species to the coastal environment, bridging the gap between the lower and upper trophic levels. And I saw Becky was on, and she'd be glad to know that someone reported something that looked a lot like a Forbes Sea Star on Tybee recently. She worked with the lab on looking at faunal makeup, basically bycatch, because we were focusing on sea stars, but the species that we were collecting along with the sea stars, looking at how their distribution can change throughout different seasons and from year to year. And it happened at a time when we thought we were going to do one thing called animal husbandry and look at several different processes in the lab, but evidently there was a global crisis in sea stars, and there was sea star wasting was such a major issue, and actually there's still papers coming out as it relates to that. Amara Davis is one of my current graduate students. She's working with spiny lobsters and Panulirus argus virus 1. It's a virus that infects the lobster, the spiny lobster specifically. Lobsters are incredibly important as a fishery to the Bahamas, and it's also recreationally important in Florida. Many people flock to Florida for the one-day rec season, and then the slightly longer season that comes a little bit later. And it's been a great partnership. We're getting there to be completed with that project, but a partnership between Savannah State, Mote Marine Lab, and the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. Amara is also a Canals Fellow, and she's a Schmidt Ocean Institute Fellow, and currently is living near Virginia to fulfill those roles. And it's great to see the process of scientific communication really come to the forefront of her science. Savannah Geiger is another of my current students. She is close to finished. I think she's getting the last bits of data that she needs to do, and up in the top right corner you can kind of see it's just like mini instrumentation, right? It's an instrument in a box that you can't really tell too much from, but the Raman microscopy, spectral microscopy, is a way to do a secondary analytical technique on microplastics. And it's been great having Savannah kind of launch the latent interest in the lab in microplastics, kind of to that next level. And we've made a lot of great partnerships as she has been advancing through the program. And she has worked directly with 7 undergraduate students, and 2 of the more senior ones are focused on, Joe Day is focused on digestive and respiratory uptake of microplastics in several of the fish species and a few invertebrates that we have in the region. And Taylor Fields Reynolds is focusing on shrimp tissue digestion, and later we'll be working on looking at microplastics in Penaeid shrimp. Taylor Ransom, she started last spring. She got the privilege of starting in the spring right before COVID hit, and it's been a wild ride ever since. She's working in freshwater zooplankton and has really started taking off now, getting her samples and starting her analyses and looking at how interactions between zooplankton and microplastics can change the nature of that. The texture of the plastics can be in the gut of the zooplankton, and just the ecology around the microplastics in freshwater environments. Systematic approach, right? The deliberate development along the way has led to this interest in what happens when we bring in a diverse cohort of students that are focusing on microplastics, because there's so many questions in this region. Not many people are studying it in the natural environment, and looking at peer and near peer mentoring, science communication, and community engagement, as well as collaboration, and how these can play a major role in attracting students to the sciences and keeping them in the sciences. So I won't dwell on that too much now. That's kind of more for maybe the faculty who might be more interested in those discussions, but I wanted to mention it, how it's so important to engage with your colleagues while you're going through undergraduate and graduate study, because those are your colleagues for your professional career as well. And so oftentimes when we say science, we can mean a lot of different things. Even the nature of the term geoscience is kind of lots of debate around what that actually means. Is it just a different term for geology? Is it more inclusive of the earth sciences? And it depends on who you talk to. There have been lots and many discussions around the topic. Does it include environmental science and environmental biology? Does it include toxicology and ecology? And so it's caused me to kind of use geosciences and the interactions in geosciences to help in the community by focusing on what does it mean for the resources, by sharing geosciences with the general populace. What does it mean for the resources? Is it better conservation of our natural resources? And the answer it seems to be yes. We are working on collecting data around that topic of, how do people identify the geosciences, and does it really help them by growing their understanding of geosciences to be better stewards of the environment. And so I focus on doing meaningful science. And I know all science is meaningful, right? Depends on how the lens that you use to look at it. But the tools that we could use to do the science, we focus on in our lab group, because I started out kind of Spartan in terms of not really having a lot of tools, but have over the years grown that. It's also allowed me to grow my collaborations, my partnerships, because it allowed me to be able to have my students be able to access more resources, more instrumentation, and multiply the broader impacts by research students. Because otherwise I'd be trying to do all this by myself in the lab, and that pretty much wouldn't work. And so I focus on non-science majors quite a bit because of just the fact that there are more people who say they are not scientists compared to those who say they are. And the entrepreneurial community as well, because they are often involved in the use of natural resources. And K-12 is a growing part of what we do as well. And so I won't spend much time on this slide, but I wanted to put it here so that you can refer to it maybe later on. Coastal hazards was kind of my launch point into all of this GER stuff, geoscience education research, GER, and looking at how to get stakeholders around the table in these coastal environments to be able to be more sustainable with the resources that we are exposed to, as well as build equity in the use of those resources. What introduced me to that in a big way was the Earth Educators Rendezvous, and I'm plugging it here because it's something that's a great opportunity, particularly the preparing for an academic career. I'm mentioning that to your graduate students because it's a great opportunity to see things like teaching demos, but also being able to learn about how people learn, so metacognition, and also plotting that pathway to be able to be the most effective teacher that you can be, most effective instructor that you can be. Couple of links in here to the service learning in undergraduate sciences, geosciences, and how we need to do something different because of people's perception of what earth sciences are, to really build community, to draw in cultural relevance and expose people to the broader field of geosciences through education and outreach as a part of the science that we do. It doesn't have to be this separate siloed thing off to the side. It can be integrated within the activities that we do. And one of the things that has come out many, many, many times is it recognized in tenure and promotion considerations? That's for maybe some of the grad students might be interested in that discussion. I find that when we do the preparing for an academic career, lots of them ask about that, whether service learning, education and outreach, whether those are a part of tenure and promotion at the institutions that you're considering. Couple more partnerships that we are quite heavily involved in. I'll just kind of mention and name the cooperative science centers. It's a huge part of NOAA's educational partnership program out of the Office of Education. And I would be glad to speak with you at length about that. We were heavily involved with the EPP program in both our master's and PhD, and they are some of the longest running programs out of NOAA's Office of Education. Last but not least, the IUSE GeoPaths that was mentioned at the onset. We are in our third year, and we are focused on a deep dive instrument that basically allows, starting out at HBCUs, because of the impact that HBCUs have on the production of K-12 educators, the production of geoscience researchers. What are the best practices? What are the things that are allowing this to work well? And what are some of the things that could be improved upon? And so we focus on delivering a strategic multidimensional solution to impact middle school teacher preparation curricula and professional development activities, as well as improve minority access to the geosciences. So it is multi-tiered, definitely putting broader impacts right at the front. And why middle school? For those who aren't in GER, aren't in geoscience education research, you may not know 6th grade is pretty much the place for geoscience education being formally kind of interjected into school, K-12 schools. And there's other places depending on where you're located, but that's on the national standard. That's really the point, the grade level. And so we're focusing on early educators, in-service teachers, as well as pre-service teachers, and helping them find the tools that they need in order to be able to deliver a strong message to the these budding scientists, these 6th graders, because if they have a negative experience, it can be marring. If they have a positive experience, it can be transformative in a positive way. And so I have so many more things. When they said 30 to 35 minutes, I was worried. I was like, man, 30 years worth of stuff. I don't know if I can fit it in 30 minutes, but I kind of have some images here that we can talk about if there's time, or at the end if anyone hangs around and wants to talk a bit. And I thought this might be kind of interesting. I participate in the traveling workshop program, and one of the things that we do is backwards design of what kind of student we want to see out of our programs. And this was one that we did at an institution a couple of years ago for the ideal student. And these were characteristics of the ideal student from their perspective. And so lots of other things. I have 2 sets that are kind of like that, that I can share. And then I also have some of the major findings, the things that I have already mentioned, but I just kind of put them in a list here, and so that way we can have it as a part of the talk, and we can have it for later. Maybe we could take a few questions.
I have a couple that from students I can read out as we see as the chat populates. One question was, what are some of the obstacles and solutions you found to balancing your disciplinary research, so in marine science, with education development and outreach? So how do you balance those things?
So in my case, I have a phenomenal chair, and I don't even know if she's on, but it's true. Having someone to support the interest, it's something that if I couldn't do it, this would not be worth it for me. So the education and outreach component of what I do is really meaningful. And so I just make the time for it, and I'm grateful that I have someone that supports those efforts.
Great. And we have one in the chat from Dr. Chanana Mitra. She was asking you what is for the ideal student workshop, or what is an ideal student workshop for which grade, or is it college students?
So the traveling workshop program is basically inviting a team to basically lead a discussion with the person who has made that first contact. And then the team comes. Usually we actually travel, but this past 12 months or so, it's been virtual traveling workshop. And it is focused on undergrads and grads, but that's primarily because these are at undergraduate institutions. But the ideal student exercise was a part of building stronger departments, because usually the department is aiming towards having a certain type of student come out of their program representing the product of the program. I hope that answered your question.
Great, thank you. Someone else has asked, and I'm also curious, you talked about it a little bit, but you know, you talked about GER and how Integrate got you into that. Was that your main pathway to DBER? You know, it seems like it was maybe a little more gradual, you know, like what was kind of was it just a passion for outreach, and then that you slowly got connected with the GER community that you talked about earlier? GER meaning Geoscience Education Research.
Yeah, it definitely did not start out as something so formal as GER. The Geoscience Education Research community is definitely focused. And so I just kind of play in the sandbox with them a bit. And it's every time I jump in, I learn something new. And it was not where I started. It was not where I intended to be, but it's the coastal hazards work and recognizing that learning how people learn and learning how people address things that are of interest to them would be helpful for me to be a better communicator of science. And so that's really what drew me into the geoscience education research community.
That's awesome. You know, as a geoscience education researcher and also someone who teaches a science communication class, that's just fabulous. Everybody taking science comm right now. There's another question in the chat from one of our biologists, I believe, faculty. Do you keep records of the approximate number of students in the marine science program at Savannah State that go into research or PhD programs?
So that is a great question. We participate in the Consortium for Ocean Leadership's Ocean Science Educators Retreat. And sometimes that actually looks like a meeting, and sometimes that looks like data gathering. And so each year we report out those data, and we also keep a running tab of where people are and what they're doing. And so to say that there's this particular number, we would have to dig at that time and update those data, but we do keep a running tab of where our students are and where geographically, but also professionally.
And I've got another question. In the context of your K-12 work, how do you go about code switching, in quotations, from a professional setting, so like going from graduate and students and faculty to, you know, to teaching youth? Like, how do you make that transition smoothly?
That one is a tough one sometimes. The reason why I say that is I find that there are periods of time when I'm spending quite a bit of time going between the two communities, and then other times where I could go for months and months, and then it's very difficult to get back on the horse and continue with that kind of K-12 environment. But our education expert, whenever I want to jump back in, she's ready for, here's a science night opportunity, or here's coast camp opportunities, or science and engineering fair. We do that every year. And also the Stingray Bowl, which is basically a bowl just for marine and marine biology, marine science, oceanography. So that helps.
Yeah, and so what do you think is the best way to engage the youth that you or your students or your various funded projects that you've had? I saw a hands-on thing earlier that you did, or that one of your students did with the K-12 environment. And so this question that the student is asking is, how do you get them to want to be scientists and to really want to get engaged in the process of science?
So I think if I had to pick one, I'd pick one off of this list that I have up at the moment. Kind of meeting people where they are, finding what is valuable to them, important to them. And that really works in terms of bridging gaps, in terms of policy, in terms of K-12, in terms of interacting with teachers, because teachers speak a whole different language from those in academia. At least it seemed that way to me when I was first getting started. They could talk and it just felt like they were truly speaking a different language. And so just meeting where they are and then trying to find common ground, it really makes such a big difference in terms of just being able to have a real meaningful conversation other than just lip service.
Yeah, great, thanks. So we've got a couple more questions that came in the chat, and I'm going to try to, or Jeffrey Habron, I think Dr. Habron, he said, I wish I had known about Savannah State in the 1980s. Glad to see how the university has evolved with Rasmus, and also working with HBCU and diversity. He was not aware of any of that. How has the transformation been for you? Have you seen a change in the number of African Americans in marine sciences as undergrads, graduate students, and in the profession? And how is Savannah State doing with recruitment of underrepresented students in marine science specifically, I think the question.
So this picture here, let's see if I can grab both of them. Okay, there's the other one there. This is kind of what my classroom often looks like. This is a COVID classroom. You know, everyone's donning the masks and spaced out, you know, distanced a bit. But all my classes look like that. And none of my classes growing up looked like that. I was always in classrooms where I pretty much was the only one. It wasn't until I came to Savannah State that I really saw a lot more people who were interested in the marine sciences that looked like me. So it didn't faze me all that much, but I think the opportunity of being able to see a broad range of students and be able to help them recognize what their goals are and be able to realize the goal. It's such a, I don't know, aha moments is what the phrase of the day has been when I've talked in other groups today. But just to be able to see a group that is similar to what our society looks like, it's really quite awesome. And so I do feel like I'm seeing differences, but I also do interact in a broad range of groups. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Another question we have in the chat, we've got a couple more. when you do research with middle school and high school students, do you attempt to problem solve? Like, what can we do as the pH is getting way off of this body of water or something like that? Or is it more data gathering? So I think there might be getting at what step of the inquiry process do you utilize with students in the scientific approach?
So that one is, unfortunately, the answer is it depends. It really, but that's the truth of the matter, is that some are ready for true exploration and some need a little bit of a nudge to really understand why we're doing it, and then they're ready. And so the starting point may be different. The on-ramps may be different, but you're still trying to get them on the pathway to either be a stronger steward or be someone who's actually in the field doing the sciences. And citizen or community science is a valuable part of what we do. It's hard to get funding for monitoring research or basic exploratory research. So it's nice to partner with communities to have them take water samples and look at how the water samples are changing over time and based on how they're putting out fertilizers as an HOA or something like that. It's kind of a range, looking at historic samples of sediment from an area where we want to put a community garden, for example. Redlining is not, I don't have that on any of my slides, but I'm a part of a redlining group that is related to metal toxicity. And that's been an eye-opening experience as far as EJ, environmental justice issues.
We have another one, which I can definitely resonate with as far as being a GER researcher. I didn't always start as a GER researcher, and I definitely had to learn a different language and be bilingual. But this question is a little different when it's asking about when you talk with teachers, where you talk with teachers, you mentioned them having a different language, and have you had to use a lot of, learn a lot of education jargon due to your outreach?
I do it because it helps the conversation. Because sometimes the terminology is just different, but we're still saying the same things. And so sometimes it's a matter of just bridging that gap. And other times it is totally something that maybe as an higher ed professor, that we look at it differently than K-12, but it's a necessary part of K-12 for the student to be ready for higher ed. And so it's important for me to understand that if I am going to provide the service or provide the exchange with K-12 pre-service, K-12 in-service learners, you know, whether that's professional development or their formative training, because then I can help them find the tools that they need in order to stand confidently in the classroom and teach the material. So it's worth it.
The question I had from another student, and I think you answered some of this, but while you were talking, and especially in the conversation you had with your student just yesterday, but they were wondering what keeps you inspired to keep doing what you're doing as far as the community engagement and collaboration, especially given there might be more obstacles and things like that. You know, what keeps you going?
I think I was just blessed with the ability to not sleep. Most of my colleagues are like, wait, why are you sending me messages at this hour of the night? Yeah, I need to break that habit. But in general, the drive comes from knowing that I'm getting the opportunity to do important work. And so it's just that level of excitement that comes along with it. And seeing the light bulb come on for someone to say, wow, yeah, we need to recycle, and here is why. Wow, we don't need to allow debris to go down the drains, and here is why. So when you see the light bulb come on, it just kind of launches you to the next level of um, passion for doing the work, really.
Thank you so much. I definitely learned a lot about more of the work you've been doing. And not only do we have marine science in common, but I also had a GK-12 and I'm a GER researcher. And there's so much that you said that is really, really great and interesting. And the shared overlaps, I think, with our NRT project and there's a lot of biologists on the line too, and I know you've been in touch with them here at Auburn as well. If you guys have any questions for Dr. Ebanks, please put them in the chat. We are on a little bit more secure line just because of the open invitation, so I'm sorry for the difficulty to have to put it in chat, but we just want rather be safe than sorry. So feel free to, if you have, we got a few more minutes for if there is any other burning questions. And Katie has been populating the chat with a number of links that Dr. Ebanks gave us that you might want to continue to explore after today's talk. So be sure to get that before we close out the program. Be sure to be looking at all of these various links. And the last link Katie put in, thank you very much, was a link to our NRT program here at Auburn. If you are doing anything, it's very interdisciplinary. You don't have to be from the geosciences to apply. Our next application cycle would be for the 22, wait, not next year, but the year following. COVID has totally messed up my timeline in my brain. I'm like, what year, what month are we in? But anyway, please explore that and apply for our next cycle, which would not be next academic year, but the year following. And oh, we have one more question, so I don't want to leave without asking it. For Dr. Ebanks, you talked about being lucky enough to teach in diverse classrooms. Does this alter your teaching methodology or give you a different insight from colleagues from other universities with less diversity, basically?
That's a great question, because there's different types of diversity. There's preparation. You know, had someone come through a program that has prepared them for college? Are they first time? How many of them in the room are first time college students? How many in the room are of underrepresented minority for that particular field? There's just such a wide array of points that you can look at for diversity, and it's interesting that in any given class we kind of hit quite a few of those different points, honestly. And just kind of thinking about some of the classrooms that I've been in, whether it's different majors or whether it's looking at whether they want to do it as a career in government, career in industry, academia, K-12. And yes, it does impact. And I spend a good amount of time towards the beginning of class when I first start a semester, trying to get people to share that and understand that if I keep the goal in front of them, then they tend to be more motivated to press on and do well in the class, regardless of the challenges.
But I think that an important point you said was that you consider that your class comes from various backgrounds, and you're thinking about that. What it sounds like is you're thinking about that as an instructor and trying to tease out that information, so you know you don't consider your students blank slates.
Definitely not.
You understand that they definitely come in with different experiences and different ways they can contribute and things like that. That sounds great.
Definitely.
Okay. Well, I just want to give a round of applause for Dr. Ebanks for coming. We asked her to just kind of tell us about her pathway and her research, and we kind of gave her a big thing to bite off, and I feel like she kind of nailed it with just really kind of giving us a flavor of some of the things she's doing, and giving us all the wonderful work she's doing, and that there are different pathways of academia and different ways you can make an impact as an academic as well. So thank you so much. I hope we can continue collaborating and conversing with you. And yeah, I'm gonna try to figure out how to make my hand clap for you. If everyone else can, that would be great. There we go, I found it. It's in your reactions. So thank you all so much. And for everybody who's on the call, spending your Friday afternoon, and even for the Eastern folks who are on the call, it's an hour later. So thank you so much, and hopefully everyone will have nicer weather than it's been to enjoy the weekend.
Definitely. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.